Grind off the rust and get ready to thrust. When it comes to the rapier, finesse is a must. Today we're going to stab our way into the Renaissance. Hello, my name is Lauren Danger. You're watching my video. Prepare to be entertained. And with that little send up of The Princess Bride, which I just rewatched, welcome to today's video. And we are going to talk about the rapier. And yes, in The Princess Bride, which I've seen about a dozen times, maybe more, probably more. I mean, it's a fantastic movie. And we do have some good rapier fight scenes in it. They're movie fighting, but they're fantastic. So there is a lot of clack, slap, slap, slap. And the rapier is okay for that, but we're going to look a little bit more at the actual techniques of the rapier, because most of what you do is the thrust. You're going to jab that rapier into someone and ruin their day. Now, it can be used on the battlefield, but not as common a battlefield weapon. Certainly good for self-defense, civilian life, can be fancy, and a little bit of history about the rapier and how it develops before we get into our actual techniques. So the rapier, definitely a Renaissance sword. From the cut and thrust of the late medieval and early Renaissance, we get a blade shape that is much thinner. I mean, there is still tapering from the base of the blade towards the point, but not as much as an earlier sword. So if we go back 300 years, in the 14th century, we'll have a wider base to our blade. Now these are 300 years apart. This model of rapier is representative of something that's very early 17th century. So from early 14th to early 17th century, big difference. Big difference in the way they look. And mostly dedicated for the thrust. So the blade is slender, comes to a nice point. You can still cut with the rapier. We'll talk about some cutting moves you can do with the rapier. It's not going to hack through things. It's not going to be like an arming sword of the Middle Ages that can really dig into flesh if you are getting around armor. But as a sword for civilian life, for self-defense on the road, and some battlefield applications, because they are still fairly nice, it's a good sword to have. But this cage hilt is very fancy. That's why I say 17th century. We can go back into 16th century, so the 1500s, and we're going to see a few finger rings. So we'll see parts that you might have the curved quillins, you might have just a few rings for the fingers, and you won't have quite this cage hilt design quite yet. But when we look at the manuals, and there are a lot of fencing manuals that talk about how to use the rapier, it's fantastic. And yes, The Princess Bride mentions some of those names, right? We have Agrippa, we have Capoferro, we could go on and on and on, and there are, Tybalt, and they mentioned Bonetti's defense, and there's so much. A lot of fun stuff to study. But when you hold the rapier, most importantly, you grab and you loop the finger around the crossguard here. That's what the rings and the cage is for. So instead of holding it like this, like we do earlier swords, because we're mostly going to be dedicated to the thrust, and because the blade is much longer, we want the stability. This is a 37 inch, but we can definitely have rapier blades over 40 inches. Very long, very good for reach. And as time goes by, as we get to the beginning of the 17th century, we have the fancier cage hilts, we have cup hilts, particularly in Spain, and we have these wonderful traditions of it's going to look good. So when you're carrying this around, you can have fancy rapiers. They could be gilded, lots of decoration, really show your status to other people, as well as being something to defend yourself and to duel with. And yes, excellent for dueling. When we study rapier, and we haven't done rapier in about 3 years, and you get a little too close with rapier to do during pandemic times, but it's a lot of fun for sparring. Watching people spar with proper rapier technique, it's very subtle, very fast little movements. In the movie, you have to do bigger motions for movie fighting because you want the audience to be able to see and understand. just little disengages, thrusts. I'm just making up some stuff off the top of my head, and yeah, it's fun stuff like that. But basics then on how to fight with the rapier. Being right-handed, because I am not left-handed. Could have a lot of little Princess Bride references, I'm sure. Right foot is going to be forward majority of the time, 95%, maybe even more than that. You have your rapier angled at the opponent. It can be lower, but generally you want to have the point up. And there are different guards, different hand positions that you can have, but your left hand, in this case, your offhand, we'll just say, is also out. Very different from Olympic fencing, where you might have the hand back and using it for balancing. Well, you have it out front. And the reason you have it out front is because you can actually use it to set aside the opposing blade. So I want the hand to be ready. The thrust comes in. I can set it aside. I can return with my own thrust. Of course, the opponent can then set it aside. There are various guards to move through, but your standard resting guard, your elbows are in, and this is the depths of the third guard. You can have a fourth guard, you can go to second, come all the way up to fifth. So you can have the rapier in this kind of semicircle of positions for various moves. But most of the time what you're going to do is you're going to worry about outside, inside, you're parrying your opponent. If you go to parry and if you go to thrust and you get parried to the direction you don't want to be, then we call it a disengage, where you make a little circle, just a little circle. So I go to thrust, I get stopped, I make a little circle, turn the rapier, I have the strong on weak, I thrust inward, and there we go. So lots of finesse, lots of subtle little movements of the rapier. And I won't go into a lot of how to rapier fight. It's just some basics to show that, yeah, for the most part, you are looking to thrust in. And of course, most famously, the lunge. And my favorite scene in The Princess Bride for sword fighting is Inigo takes on the 4 castle soldiers. There are 4 guards with Count Rugen. And Count Rugen wants the guards to fight Inigo, and he does all these fancy moves, but the last one is this lunge, and he gets really low, and he comes up and lunges in. Lunging, very important. Back foot stays, front foot lifts up, and you plant it, and you thrust, and you come under. So you drop your body, you're getting more reach that way, and the rapier is a lot about reach. It's about covering distance, and that's why your right foot's always forward, and then you can just explode into that lunge and thrust upward, and that's pretty cool. But you can cut with a rapier as well. It is sharp, and you can give little cuts. Like I said, you're not going to be able to cleave through things, not the same way we would with earlier swords, but a little cut to the arm of the opponent, you can get in, cut across someone's arm. Your muscles definitely, they take a lot of strain holding your rapier out all the time in this position. There's no having it up on your shoulder. There's no other guards. You want your point forward all the time. So all of your guards are going to be out front. So you're going to have that strain. So you can imagine cutting someone's arm. Even a small cut, damaging some of the muscles, it's going to make it difficult for them to hold the rapier. Or, better still, cut to the face. You get in, you can't quite reach with your thrust, you're out of the range, but you can just quickly extend and cut above the eye, and then blood gets into the opponent's eye, and that takes them out of the fight. So there are those little tricks, those little cuts. You could even, if you had a chance to cut the leg, not generally target, but you could cut into someone's leg, reduce their mobility a bit. Little wounds that you can do. So the rapier does cut, so practice a few quick little cuts if you're doing rapier, but the majority of the damage is done with the thrust. So a quick little overview of rapier. Now, in video games, role-playing games and stuff, this becomes the finesse weapon, but it's the same kind of setting where you also have your arming sword. So I see a lot in especially the role-playing game culture where the rapier is your finesse weapon. So your dexterity, your agility characters are all using their rapiers, but it's kind of out of place. You can't really fight someone in plate armor if you have a rapier. You have to do a lot of work to try and get into those gaps, and because it's a thinner blade and it'll probably have some flex to it, it's not going to be able to get through any kind of padding or mail armor that's in those joints. It's definitely best suited for civilian life, for your everyday clothing. Unarmored fights with rapiers, lots of fun to do. In class, in practice, I wouldn't want to be in a real rapier fight. I don't think anyone wants to be in any real sword fight. They're all going to be very nasty and brutal. But because The Princess Bride, it has inspired me, a little talk about the rapier. And thank you very much for watching. Do remember to like, subscribe, and of course, your comments, because you have the input to kind of shape what we do on the channel. And so what you'd like to see from me, make suggestions, and I'll see what I can do. I'm always happy to respond to comments and provide more information if you have questions about what we've studied. Alright, so we are at the end of the video. I hope that you have a fantastic day, and remember, if you have a suggestion as to what to do for future video, my response will simply be, as you wish.